In a previous video, I talked about the new const keyword that you can use to make constants in JavaScript, which is a type of variable that doesn't change value. In this video, we'll take a look at the let keyword. Let was introduced with ECMAScript 2016 and is another way to declare variables. It's similar to var in that you use it to declare variables, not constants, but it's also quite a bit different than var because let creates a different kind of scope. As of ECMAScript 2015, JavaScript only had two kinds of scope, global scope and function or local scope. That means that variables declared with var are either global variables that are visible everywhere in your code, or a variable that's local to a function, visible everywhere in that function. And that's mostly okay, but it does have a couple of subtle consequences. One is if you forget to declare your local variables with var, those variables are hoisted into the global scope, which can have potentially unintended consequences, and that's still the case with JavaScript now. Another is that you can refer to a variable before it's defined without getting a reference error. So if I run this code that defines cat above where we print its value, we can see the value of cat is fluffy. If I move the declaration of cat below where I'm printing the value of cat, now we see the value of cat is undefined. In other words, we're not getting a reference error. The variable cat has been hoisted, so it's as if you wrote your code like this, where we first declare the variable cat and then define it after we've printed the value. And this hoisting happens even if you're declaring a variable inside a block. And even if that block is never executed, like happens here. And this happens because the scope of the variable cat is the entire pets function. Now it's important here to remember the difference between a declared variable and a defined variable. Remember in JavaScript that a variable that's been declared has an initial value undefined. In other words, the variable's been declared but not defined. It's defined when you assign a value to that variable. So if we try to access a variable that hasn't been declared in the console, we get a reference error. So like this variable zebra, we haven't declared it, so if we try to reference it, we get a reference error. If we declare a variable moose, but we don't define it, then we get the value undefined when we access the variable moose. Let behaves a bit differently from var. With let, we get block scoping, meaning that the scope of the variables you declare with let is limited to the block they're in. Now that can be the whole function, but it can also be another block, like an if block. So for instance, if we declare cat inside this if block with a var, and then print the value of cat after the if block is complete, we see the value of cat. We don't get undefined and we don't get a reference error, and that's because the scope of var is the entire function. Now, if we change that var to let, what do you think will happen? Well, let has block scope. So when we run this code now, we get a reference error because the scope of let is limited to the if block, and so that variable cat is no longer visible outside that block. It's also no longer visible above where it's declared, like it was before. So this behavior of let is a little bit more intuitive. It's weird to think of variables being declared above the statements that declare them. And it's a lot easier to understand for programmers who are coming to JavaScript from other languages, where this kind of behavior is more of the norm, the behavior that we see with let. So with var, as you've seen, if a variable is declared inside a block nested within a function, the scope of that variable is still the entire function, even though you might more intuitively think that the scope of the variable should be limited to the block. So that means if you use var to declare a variable inside a block, you can still access that variable after the block in which it's declared and defined has completed executing, as you saw. Again, this is because var has function scope, not block scope. But with let, we have block scope, and the scope of the variable is really limited to the block in which the variable is declared. So now we cannot access the variable cat outside this if block, and when we do, try, we get a reference error. You can actually see the block scope using the JavaScript developer tools in your browser. I'm in Chrome, and so if I switch to the Sources tab and add a breakpoint at the line of code inside the if block, we'll be able to see that block scope appear. So I'll reload the page and call the pets function, and then we can see the block scope appear. Notice that cat is undefined because I haven't actually executed this line of code to define cat yet. When I continue the code and we jump out of the if block and to the next line of code, you can see the block scope disappears along with cat, and if we continue to run the code, then we get a reference error on the console.log line, which is trying to display the value of cat. So, two important things to remember about let are, when you declare a variable with let, it is not defined until the line of code where you declare and define that variable is executed. And when you declare a variable with let inside a block, that variable has block scope. It's not visible or accessible outside the block in which it's declared. The way let works is pretty fundamental change in the way that variables work in JavaScript. Note though that var is not going away. We don't want to break the web, but you might want to consider using let instead of var when you can. Just remember that while all modern browsers now support let, if you have someone who might be viewing your web pages with older browsers, say maybe older than 2 years old, your web pages will break for them. If you know that all your users are on up-to-date browsers, then go right ahead and start using let today. Using let also has some other interesting implications for programming in JavaScript, but we'll get to those in another video. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any videos in this series on new features in JavaScript. And if you need to learn JavaScript from scratch, you can pick up Head First JavaScript Programming, where we take you through learning JavaScript from the beginning. Thanks for watching.